Good morning, colleagues. My name is Miponi Selima Salesa. I'm in the Regents and Student Affairs. It is my great pleasure to come to talk to you today. It's a very much eventful week. As we are talking to you, I feel very much humbled with what Dr. Jacobs has done. Really what is happening in our country. We might say that it's happening internationally, but we are affected. And when you talk about this thing, you also think about protection of our students. An eventful week as it is, as we are talking, I'm talking to you now, the Zimbabweans are mourning. The corpse of our legend has arrived, and it will lay in state today and tomorrow. So Africa is mourning for a hero. But what is more sad is that we are still encountering issues of xenophobia. As we are talking about this, in UNISA, ladies, we are always holding the cradle. The women are praying for peace in South Africa, more especially, because the xenophobia that we are facing is actually one-sided. But for now, I think we are dealing with issues of drugs, which was never the issue in South Africa. I'm going to participate in this important conversation, and thank you very much, Cape Town, for bringing this into light. Fostering student academic resilience in the context of diverse student identities, experiences, but I would like to draw your attention more especially to where I am now. Regional services and student affairs. What are the identities of our students and what are their experiences? That is very, very important, because if we are focusing on academic resilience and we are talking about the context of student affairs and regional services, then we have to look at ourselves, Dr. Jacobs and colleagues, to say, what is it that we are doing that we should foster academic excellence or academic resilience? Number one, I would like us to understand the context as saying what is actually the academic resilience. What are we expecting from the students? The simplest definition that was put across says it is a drive to learn on your own, ability to work effectively to achieve success regardless of personal risk factors. So it means that you can be sick, but are you still able to be resilient in your academic environment? You might not have a roof over your head. And what about your academic work? Now, two things that are very, very important to me and to you as an educator in this room. Identity of our student. Who are they imitating, emulating, or wishing to be their model? Because that speaks to their identity. Number two, what are their experiences when they are in the regions? Remember that I said my focus will only be on student affairs and regional services. So the regions, 6, that is here in our midst. What type of an experience do you give to the students in your region? I would like to bring the background to you as follows. UNISA students operate in a different environment, but then you check and look at the business model. The business model of UNISA since its inception. Let's look at this. From manual to correspondence to distance learning to open distance learning, to open distance e-learning. That's where we are currently now. Very quite interesting, isn't it? But then, when you have identified the models, you now go back and say, but actually, who am I talking to? Who was UNISA student during the times of UNISA being manual correspondence and so on? And then who is currently UNISA student? Then you have to look at the profile. You have to look also at the demographic. But initially, from 1879, when UNISA was conceived, it was initially meant for adult learners who are working, who have missed opportunities to learn, but in the adult level. Some of them in jail, some who are married and were unable to pursue their studies, and then specifically to teachers to upgrade qualifications. UNISA was not meant for youngsters. That's what you have to understand, and that's what we are struggling with in student affairs and in regional services. Then let's look at the current. The student demography changed drastically from high school directly they are coming to UNISA. And they have got reasons because they're either not accepted in residential institutions due to lack of qualifying scores or other factors because their parents cannot even be able to pay their enrollment fees. Now, comparing the two scenarios, you can see that now this institution is actually having a lot of work that it has to do. Now, let's leave that part because it has actually shared with us the identity of our students now have to come up. Experiences before and after. Have you seen these adverts whereby maybe they are showing you the skin? They will say before, and then they show this horrible type of skin, and then the after, then this glowing skin. So now the experiences of our students, we have to say before and after. When you look at the time when UNISA was just a distance, it was encouraging that the student should be an independent learner who is self-reliant, disciplined and matured, and also responsible. But then, now the demography, young students that are coming into UNISA. We started with student support, from the study guides now to face-to-face learning. So you just look at the evolution there. Because now, you're moving from that correspondence, study guides, independent learning now. Once you introduce a face-to-face whereby there is a tutor, then some type of dependency is created. Then we are saying, no, we have not forgotten the roots. Then we introduce blended learning. Then we again move and say, but we've got this infusion of face-to-face and technology. That's where your E, little e, comes in. And I always say that we are putting it so little because we're still not yet sure about it. But these challenges, the throughput and the retention in UNISA, but we still remain with a challenge, a very serious challenge, that we need to capacitate our students so that we can be able to make them pass. The regional directors in our midst, I don't see Mr. Kokung, but I can see Pulokwan, I can see Dr. Jacobs, I can see I see Mr. Kokung right at the back. Colleagues, I want to draw your attention to NSFAS related issues. That's the current scenario now. Our students are crying about the NSFAS allowances. Currently, there are outstanding issues of 2017 and 2018. When they talk about S-Bucks allowances, it might mean a small thing to you, but then it's a very big thing to the students who doesn't have anything in their pockets, starting from to buy a book, or to take a taxi to Payroll Center. So this is very serious. Now we are talking about the experiences of our students, because now we said that we are going to support them. And then the government agreed with us, NSFAS is here. But is it building a positive experience of our students? Let's carry on. Now, the main challenge is that when it gives UCT students between 20 to 35,000 to be capacitated, then when it comes to UNISA, it gives them between 3,000 to a maximum 5,000. They are lucky those that are getting 10,000. So this is a disparity. And now the challenge is that what type of experience are you giving these students? Now I'm talking nationally, the government and the higher education bodies. Let's leave SBAC's allowances and NSFAS and continue. Then we got the DHET March. And I'm very proud to say that I sat for almost 3 days working on the DHET March. And I know the students in Cape Town will say that we couldn't get the equal opportunity, but then we were represented. It was a very peaceful march. You know why management supported this? Because of the disparities that exist between other institutions and UNISA students. They will only benefit with a book allowance and an incidental allowance. That actually doesn't make anything. Then you carry on. There is another part of the appeals processes. The appeal processes that happens is that NSFAS doesn't accommodate UNISA students. It doesn't know about the semesters that UNISA is conducting. Like now, the appeal processes for our students has passed. So it means that they won't even be accommodated in 2020. Then that's the experience of our students. And we are saying that we want to improve our retention and throughput. We carry on to say that when they are dealing with this important task, remember that NSFAS, to them, it's their life and death. It's their survival. Then they are not assisted by anybody. They face this monster alone. No administrative personnel in the regions to assist them. Regions experience inadequate resources that they scramble to have the resources to support the students. Let's look at communication. No answer to telephones. That is what goes to the experience of our students. No answer to emails by the lecturers. No answer to assignments. No feedback. And then the recent tweet was examination results. If you go deeper and investigate, what is our student experience? Because now the student gets English 101 with 80 marks today. Tomorrow another marks of the same subject being 52. And I was really sad to hear that one student actually got a distinction, but he was supposed to write that module twice, because with that 75% that is a distinction, it was a written fail. So you got 75, then on the side, it's a written fail. And because of your experience, you don't even know who's your lecturer. At the end, you repeat that module. So colleagues, I'm standing in front of you and I'm concluding by saying that student academic resilience demands a meaningful participation from everybody. Dr. Jacobs spoke about a sort of a moral degeneration in our society. And I'm saying that our students, even the students in UNISA, they still need our full support. It's important that we have to know our students and their surroundings. UNISA have to learn more about student identity Where do they come from? Are they coming from Nyanga, Langa, Kailicha, and how is the situation there? And if they have to write in Voortrekker, what is the experience with Voortrekker Street? The identity also touches on the digital space that they are working in. Digital learning. Do we care to know their kind of preparedness in this environment in order to provide an adequate digital learning support? We sort of a bit confused ourselves because of the stages of the business model of UNISA that I spoke, because 5 as it is, we're still applying them, all of them. And now, what does it do to our students' identity and experience? I would like to say thank you very much, and thank you, Cape Town, for affording me this opportunity to talk about things that affect our students, that talks to their identity and their experience. So is it a positive or a negative experience that we're putting across for our students? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Moipoli Masalesa, our Executive Director of Regions, and for summarizing the overview, the evolution of UNISA since 1879. For us, it's everyday news, but for the people that attend here today that is not working at UNISA, I think it is quite informative. And then, yes, that is what we deal with in a decentralized campus. You know, we deal with the affective side of the students, which is our counseling section, where Mrs. Moipoli elaborated significantly, is our systemic services, which we call our student admin, and the scope is great, and student funding is a significant aspect and element of our services there, and obviously our cognitive learner support. So thank you once again for your welcoming address. Now, our highlight of this morning is Professor Alan Cliff from Cape Town, University of Cape Town. His keynote address theme is building student academic resilience in a context of diversity in higher education. So Alan Cliff is an associate professor and coordinator of the staff development cluster at UCT's Center for Innovation, Learning and Teaching. He teaches courses in educational psychology, education assessment and adult education to mostly postgraduate education students, and convenes courses in educational assessment and evaluation for students at certificate, diploma, and master's levels. Professor Cliff has supervised master's and PhD students in areas such as the development of literacy practices in disciplinary context, the use of alternate admission tests for admission and placement purposes. I think that is quite interesting, and I'm really looking forward to hear about that. If you're going to share anything on that, and then factors that facilitate the development of electronic systems literacy in the workplace. So I'm really looking forward to Professor Alan Cliff's keynote address. Welcome.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for this kind invitation to do this keynote. We didn't confer before you spoke and now I'm speaking, but it's amazing. I hear quite a number of resonances in what you have been saying this morning with what I'm going to talk about in my address. So I will try to connect to some of those, but thank you for that. Those opening remarks are welcome. Okay, I'm going to take you on a bit of a sort of a journey here around the research. Well, the research that we've been doing, and I know you did refer to the research on the use of assessment for placement, for acceptance or access and placement. I will refer kind of obliquely to some of that work, but I want to take us on a sort of a more sort of perambulatory, if you like, journey. using this theme, using my theme as the theme of academic resilience in a context of diversity in higher education, and explore some of the meanings that attach to resilience as a concept. I want to look at what I believe to have been quite a sort of global north-dominated understanding of resilience, and I want to take us into a global south, if you like, notion of resilience. I also want to move us through historically ideas about resilience being located in individuals and a sort of an innate function, to the notion of resilience being much more systemic. So I'm going to take us through micro, meso, and macro levels of this notion of resilience, and I'm going to point in the address to what I think is a central responsibility of us as academics, and indeed other what we call past professional and academic support services staff in our institution, what I believe to be a central role of all of those parties in building resilience. So my argument will be to look at, from a literacy's perspective, through a literacy's lens, at what it means, what resilience means, and also to argue that all of us have a responsibility, if you like, to acquire literacies of various kinds, but we also need, I think, to, as academics, to modify our visions of literacy and to modify our perspectives on literacy, and take on, if you like, the responsibility that it is that we at some level might also not be literate. We may be illiterate, and I don't, of course, mean in the sense of reading and writing. So I'm going to take a wider sort of socio-cultural look at the notion of literacies. Do I have to operate this thing? Yes, okay, so I need to be mindful of clicking away here and also looking at this and at you, so we'll see how we go. I think I've got till 10 past 10, is that correct? So somebody needs to maybe just, that would be useful. Thank you. That's it, okay. So please just remind me about sort of maybe who somebody is timekeeping. There, that's fantastic. Yeah, the 10-minute and the 5-minute, and maybe the trapdoor that opens when the talk is supposed to finish. Okay, so let's begin. So if we're going to understand this notion of academic resilience, I sometimes use the term resilience, but let's assume that I'm talking about academic resilience. If traditionally and historically we've drawn for our definition or our understanding of resilience on notions that have come from psychology, and I'm not panning the discipline, that's my taproot anyway, but I think psychology has brought to us, from attribution theory in particular, the notion, as I was arguing right at the outset, that resilience is an innate concept. So historically we've looked quite strongly to the individual student in academia and said, in essence, what is our challenge in enabling and enabling resilience to be developed in individual students? And that's fair enough. There is clearly a component of that. We talk about self-regulated learning, we talk about self-directed learning. We assume that one of our primary goals in higher education is to have that happen for individual students. So the individualistic notion, I think, has tended to dominate the research. It's dominated our understanding of resilience, and I think it's also dominated our lens. Our lens has been to look at individual students, or to have a focus on students, and not think of ourselves as being part of the construction, the co-construction of resilience in the academy, in higher education in general. So that conception, I would argue, has been located in Western and global North theory primarily over the years. And I'm making, obviously, wide generalizations, but I wanted to argue the trend. Typically, and this is where I connect with the definitions that were talked of at the welcome, typically it's been associated with adaptation to adversity, the development of this notion of persistence, and obviously therefore the stronger likelihood of success. So our focus has been in academic development work on what do we do, what does it take to enable students to cope with adversity, adapt to the higher education circumstances and situations they find themselves in, and be successful. drawing on psychoanalytic theory, and I'm not only talking about the famous Sigmund Freud here, I'm talking about modern conceptions of psychoanalytic theory. I think that what has been useful about that body of theory is that it's helped us to understand differences between resilience and its kind of counters, if you like, resistance and reluctance. And I think we fail to understand the full dimension of the notion of student resistance, resilience, if we don't also think of its kind of maladaptive comparison or counters, which are in the theory anyway, resistance and reluctance. And I'm not going to go into detail. You can see from my slide where those things come from in terms of psychoanalytic theory. But to say, in effect, that what we see, and I think what we see in student disruption and protest now, are manifestations to some extent of all three of these processes. Now, I'm not going to say necessarily that resistance is always a negative thing. Resistance may be a positive adaptation. It may be a constructive and adaptive response in certain circumstances. And I think that the movement of 2015 through 17 helped us to understand that, even if we didn't deal with it very well, and if we didn't cope with it at the affective and subjective levels that well. Point is, for me, when does resistance become sort of a form of resilience, is what I think I'm arguing here. Reluctance, I think, is a much more passive thing, and it may be expressed in some ways in terms of what we might call, what was called way back in 1968 by Seligman, expressed as the notion of learned helplessness. And my argument in building academic resilience among students is that reluctance is perhaps more difficult to deal with than resistance, because reluctance doesn't give us anything back. So when students simply do not respond to instruction, to support, to academic development work that we do, if that is from a position of reluctance, it's actually quite difficult to deal with. So it's almost better, in my argument here, to have resistance, because resistance has animation, and one can actually deal with resistance, and one can, there is an opposition and energy there that one can actually take on. And I don't mean in the confrontational sense, that one can work with as an academic. So, but hold those thoughts for the moment. The ideas that I'm talking, hold resilience in tension with reluctance and resistance, and see them almost as three, we're not talking about a coin here, there are three sides to this kind of triangle, if you like, that I'm referring to. I think from social learning theory and psychology, what we've gained very importantly in terms of helping us to understand academic resilience is the notion of the importance, the central importance of context. And I think that is also partly what has been why attribution theory and others have been critiqued, because they've tended to occupy a space which has said resilience has some sort of universal meaning across the entire higher education sector. My argument this morning is that we have to be very conscious of the social context of higher education. So what does academic resilience mean for students? For example, in the Western Cape region or the north of this country, for students from rural areas, for students from urban areas and so on. It has different manifestations. So it's very important for us, if we're going to understand how we're going to build and develop resilience in students, to understand what it is exactly that we mean and what it looks like. So as not to confuse, say, resilience with resistance or reluctance, which is highly possible. So the significance of social understandings of resilience becomes absolutely critical. And I would argue it's been foregrounded, highlighted for us in 2015 through 17, and our own subjective, that is University of Cape Town subjective experience currently of the protests and disruptions, which again, at some level are entirely understandable and entirely adaptive in the context of what is happening in the country and was referred to earlier on this morning. At another level, though, they're very difficult to deal with. So I would challenge us to look inwardly as well at how we understand our own resistance, resilience, and reluctance in dealing with what we're dealing with in higher education. And all of this is about building building, as I'm going to argue in a moment, communities of practice, which we'll get to. So for me, a very significant idea in the context of this conversation this morning, this talk, is this notion that resilience can be both enabled and disabled or constrained by context. It is really critical for us to understand that. So what we might assume to be engagement with students that is designed to promote, facilitate, and enable resilience may actually have the opposite or the unintended consequence, and that could be highly problematic. It could leave us also with a sense of, well, indignation or sense of betrayal, or but we're doing the right thing here, or it could leave us with a sense of wanting, as many of us do in those moments, to blame the students and to say, what's wrong with these people? They don't want to be here. They're too entitled. Those kinds of that kind of language that emerges from here. Okay, I'm going to move away from psychology now to take up the notion of resilience in association with literacies as a concept. And some of you may be familiar with new literacy studies. There are names up there of people that you may know well from your own reading and your own theoretical research backgrounds. So Mary Lee and Brian Street's work in particular, which forms a backdrop to the work we've been doing in the literacies area. And if you're wondering where it all relates to, the direct research work we've been doing, the research work is on assessment of literacy, so that's where it comes from. But what was referred to earlier today, I took very seriously too, and that is, I believe that we've had to take a move, we need to look at literacies and the work that we're doing when we're trying to foster academic resilience with students. We need to take cast the net very much wider in the current context, beyond, for example, the development of text-based literacies, which are very important. So much of probably all of what we do is text-based at one level, especially if one takes a wide view of the notion of text, to the notion of digital literacies, and beyond that to multimodal engagements. And literacy can span a 180-degree spectrum, in my view, in this particular context. So we can be going literally from the notion, the very sort of basic notion of literacies about learning to read and write, right through to literacies as embedded, socially situated cultural practice, which is what I think we're aiming to do with students. If we're going to enable academic resilience in students, we have to take that much more embedded approach to an understanding of what we're doing as academic development practitioners and theoreticians. So I'm moving now into this notion of communities of practice, which many of you will also recognize and will know from the work of particularly Lev Narenga. I know it's been critiqued, and I will refer to that in a moment, but I'm taking us now, so if I talk about literacies as embedded, socially situated cultural practice, I'm taking a very wide view of what it is that we're doing in academic development in promoting resilience. We're looking at the notion of a community of practice, I would argue communities of practice, which I'll come back to when I deal with the meso and macro levels of engagement in higher education. I think the work that Mary Lee has done in the last sort of 10, maybe even 20 years has helped us tremendously in trying to understand that we need to move beyond a skills-based notion of literacy, which is important and useful, through a sort of assimilationist approach to literacies, to the development of literacies and the enablement of academic resilience, which bring students into a full participation in being able to read and understand the discourses of higher education. It's simply not going to be enough, and isn't enough, and has been proved to not be enough over the last 10 or 20 or maybe even 30 years of academic development work, to adopt an approach which says our aim in developing resilience is to give students skills. There's a kind of concretization of the notion of the development of resilience there that doesn't help us that doesn't enable the creation of ongoing conditions for resilient behavior. It might be useful, and of course the temptation is very strong to introduce skills-based coursework, skills-based interventions in academic development contexts, because that seems to us tangible, concrete, and enables students to develop, sometimes quite rapidly. But I think we make a real error if we think that that sort of disembedded practice or that decontextualized practice is going to translate into long-standing academic resilience for students. So it's not surprising then that in some cases students might learn new skills. They might learn to read and write. They might learn to develop academic essays. They might learn to do problem solving, or, and this is not wrong for us to do, or to develop concepts that they might not have been exposed to in school situations, for example, i.e. for us to bridge the gap between the secondary and the tertiary context. That's useful, but I'm arguing here it's not enough. So we need to situate that work in a wider conversation, in a wider context, and that for me is the literacies conversation. It's a much wider conversation than simply enabling students, and I'm sure we don't subscribe to this, but simply enabling students to pass exams. So our own work has been focused specifically on academic reading and writing, based on theories that relate to learning and reasoning. I will refer to that a little bit in my conversation a little bit later. I need to watch time here. But I want to just pause for a moment on the concept of building communities of practice, and I want to argue that, is that visible from the back of the room? Looks a bit faint on the screen to me. I hope so. Yes? Okay, well I'll have to talk. Is there a way of dimming the lights at all? No? Okay, I'll just talk through very briefly some of what is up on the slide there. Ah, does that look better? Yes. Even I can see that. Okay, so talk through some of what I think is the basis for developing communities of practice. And my argument here is that we take the literature and the theory around communities of practice and we weave it into the disciplinary context in which we work. So things, for example, like the development of meaning making through participation, the concept that Leib and Wenger use of reification, which in effect simply means that students begin to understand some of what they do in the higher education situation as taken for granted, not in the uncritical sense, but it becomes part of their repertoire. So it's reified to the extent that they're able to understand and work with the conceptual material they're dealing with, or the particular forms of literacies that they'll be engaging with as being part and parcel of their academic experience. We know from the work that we've been doing that part of the struggle that students have between secondary and tertiary education is about not taking or not being able to understand the conventions and formats of higher education as being part and parcel of what they can do and what they know and the like. So community here, the sense, and I think we've done quite well in this area in academic development work, a sense of joint enterprise, mutual engagement, and a shared repertoire. I think that's what foundation programs have been about. They've been about trying to develop those kinds of communities. The problem for me about that is that we've done little or nothing about the articulation between foundation programs and, say, mainstream, and I would argue wider than mainstream, the academy as a whole, and what the academy is and what it means to students. That, for me, is also critical. That's about creating those enabling conditions I was talking of earlier. At the level of, sorry, this slide is now back to, is there a way of changing the size of this? Thank you. So the notion of identity is also critical in the development of academic resilience, and it was referred to explicitly earlier on. And this, in the communities of practice work refers to a kind of negotiated experience, a sense of membership. Students feeling part of the academy, part of the institution, part of the program in which they are embedded. And I'm not, again, I'll come back to this notion, I'm not talking about a conservative, assimilationist view of membership here. It's critical engagement with membership. So students need to be enabled to engage critically with the context in which they're working. An understanding of the learning trajectory, so that's curriculum and undergrad through postgrad, the goal, the sense of where the curriculum is going. Multi-membership, thank you for 20-minute warning. Multi-membership, the idea that students belong to a number of different learning and other communities, and we're seeing that obviously in our own work. And the idea, the notion that we have global membership and local experience, which becomes absolutely critical if students are going to navigate their way through the academy and become resilient. I'm going to have to press on much faster than I'm doing at the moment. So learning here in the communities of practice work suggests an evolving mutual engagement for students and our roles as academic developers in enabling that to happen. Understanding and refining what they do, so developing as they proceed up the curriculum, and developing resilience is critically associated with developing repertoire styles and discourses. So I think what many of our students struggle with is they acquire a particular discourse in a disciplinary space, for example, and then struggle to translate it into other spaces. So we have a lot of work to do that moves in those two different directions. But as I argued earlier, participation here is not just compliance or some kind of assimilationist position. Participation means critical engagement, and that for us is, and I would argue, across all disciplinary areas. So from the proverbial hard sciences to the social and the social sciences and the humanities, all significant and important. Okay, so I think Mary Lee's work has helped us to understand literacies and our work in academic development as contextualized and embedded. And we've been able to move in her work, been pointed to in her work, as to literacy which goes beyond, this is improving by the minute, I should keep talking, from literacies as skills acquisition to assimilation to the notion that literacies is, as I said earlier, on socio-culturally situated practices and discourses. You don't have to know G's work to know the notion of uppercase D here. I'm coming back to it a little bit later on in my macro view. Right. So here, what I think is really useful and relevant about the work of Lee and others now is that she's moved into a space of looking at literacies in the in the educational technology space. Clearly, that is, and I've avoided mentioning the fourth industrial revolution, and I shall continue to avoid to mention it at this talk anyway, but that is clearly a challenge which we all face. It is a kind of literacy that is a challenge for all of us to understand, to develop, to incorporate. And the development of resilience, though, is going to be critically contingent on us being on the front foot in relation to these movements in higher education, or the movements from the business world, or the markets, or the increased digitization and so on worlds. We're doing other research, by the way, at the moment, that looks at the interplay between digitization, marketization, which is highly effective, business models, and the ways in which curriculum is being pulled apart by some of those forces. And we need to be less reactive and much more proactive in those spaces. So the notion that literacies, and this is really for me critical in our work with students in their developing resilience, the blurring of boundaries between forms of knowledge. So interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary, intradisciplinary work becoming critical in this field. But we need to be very careful in the digital space to understand that it's not an equal space. So part of developing resilience for our students is to understand that there are huge inequalities, especially in South African higher education, in the ways in which students engage the digital space, in what they understand the digital space to be about, and how they actually learn to become empowered in that space. It's not a given. And it goes beyond just the use of, say, hardware and software into a space that I think we are really challenged in relation to higher education, which is the online learning space, the space about and for me, online learning as a literacy and as an enabler in terms of academic resilience is not just about moving face-to-face into online mode. It's a different pedagogy. It requires a different form of engagement. And then a critical engagement with textual authority, which I would argue applies across all disciplines, and I think was one of the challenges we were faced with then and still are faced within the decolonization of curriculum discussions and debates and talks. That the notion that text does not have some kind of self-evident authority. There's a need to embed and contextualize it. Okay, and overwhelming amounts of reading. We're still in that space. Right. So, my argument if we're going to develop academic resilience in students is that we have to understand, we have to enable students, if you like, to read the academy. So now I'm taking my notion of literacies much wider. It's not just about engaging with texts, solving problems, doing laboratory work, etc., and writing tests and assignments. It's about understanding the language of instruction. It's about being able to understand the grammatical, textual structure of language of instruction and understand its functional and social linguistic bases. So this is our work, and I'm going to be a little bit odd here, I suppose, in saying I'm going to skip over this because I want us to move into the wider, and I know I'm running out of time. So just to say that the work we've concentrated on before the last sort of 3 or 5 years has been on trying to understand what it means for students to properly engage with text across all the disciplines. And if you're interested in talking more about that, we can do so either today or beyond this conversation in another space. I'm happy to share thoughts with people on email or to share ideas and articles and the like. So as I say, I'm going to skip over all this stuff about academic literacy specifically because I want to get in my talk to the other layers of literacy that I think are really important. So enough to say that in the textual space, if students don't understand or can't work with academic texts, clearly that's going to, clearly that's going to leave them having problems with academic resilience because they're not going to understand how to deal with the texts that they will have to deal with in the higher education setting. So the first bit of what I've been concentrating on has been arguably a kind of a micro-level engagement. I've said, what do we understand academic resilience to be in relation to students? So it has had some individualistic, if you like, focuses. I've focused on the notion that if we're going to enable students to develop academic resilience, they need to be enabled in the context. I've referred to disciplinary context, I've referred to cross-disciplinary contexts as well, to try to make the point. But I'm again coming back to the issue that for academic resilience to be meaningful, students have to be engaged beyond simply the everyday academic activities that they're engaged with. There needs to be contextualization of those activities, and I think we, as academic practitioners, have to focus quite strongly on the structure of what we offer to students. Because if we present to students something which appears to be fait accompli, something which has been developed from on high and handed down to students, if you like, we risk resilience becoming resistance or reluctance. I think, as I said earlier, reluctance is the worser form, if you like, of the maladaptation. Because we can't deal with that. We don't know what to do with students who simply don't engage at all. And we know the association is beyond that psychosocially in terms of its consequences for student mental well-being and the rest. Okay, I want to move on to the meso level. I think I'm about to be gonged at the 10-minute mark. I want to move on to the meso level here. And here, my argument around developing academic resilience in students is that it needs to move, that our notion of literacies needs also to move to include ourselves, to include who we are and how we understand what we're doing, so that we can better mediate the work that we're doing with students. If we have an unproblematic notion, for example, of knowledge as reproduction, or as knowledge as uncontested, it is highly likely that students will have that conception too, because that's what they're exposed to. And the problem with that it's not a problem per se that there are many students in academia now who have that need, who lack, for example, who miss basic exposure from the school setting. They arrive in higher education, and we know the discourse, they arrive in higher education underprepared. We use that language. That's fine. There's nothing wrong per se with that language. But what is problematic about that is if we don't move beyond that. If we continue to see our role through the literacies lens as being about, as it were, filling students up with knowledge, enabling students to legitimately bridge the gaps between secondary and higher education, but we have to be able to move beyond that. And we all well know that huge challenge. We so often talk in academic development work about how difficult it is to enable students to take up the knowledge themselves, to become knowledge makers rather than knowledge responders, and so on. But critically, in the higher education setting in this country, and I'm not going to go into facts and figures at this stage, but we know how poor our throughput rates are. We know how poor our articulation rates between undergraduate and postgraduate education are. So we know we've got a huge crisis, we've got a huge challenge, but it's not best addressed in my argument here. It's not best addressed by thinking of this as a skills-only challenge. It's a challenge which goes, for me, way beyond, and that's why I think literacies, theory literacies, understandings of literacies that apply to us and students, and of course in the wider sector, higher education sector, can be helpful. So literacy now, and curriculum literacies too, which I'll come back to in a second. Literacies for the academic now also becomes a reading of the academy. What are we doing? How do we understand our work to be associated with the much wider context of developing knowledge, developing what is the phrase again, graduate attributes that we talk about so often. How do we understand our work to be associated with that work? So taking ourselves, if you like, out of the microcosmic engagement with individual students in individual disciplines to a much wider sense of what are we doing? And I don't mean in kind of existential sense, we have enough trouble with that as it is. I'm talking much more about in the academy. What are we doing when we teach? What are we doing when students engage in tutorial work, in assignment work, in responding to assessment and the like? So building resilience is as much dependent on the student as it is on us as academics. It's related in our case to a literacies that refers to curriculum, to knowledge, teaching, learning, assessment, all the things that we regard that are fundamental building blocks in the establishment of students' development work, fundamental building blocks and contributions to students developing resilience, but we need to understand them. And I would say in this particular context of higher education in this country, we are faced in particular with the last few notions that I've referred to on the screen there. The development of an understanding of diversity, as an affordance, not a stumbling block. I think we often see diversity as a problem. As a problem and a challenge to be faced. We need to be looking at it as an affordance. So literacies there, socio-culturally situated, embedded literacies being, let's look at diversity and what it takes. Let's move away, if you like, and we've been talking about this honestly for years, 30 or I don't know how long I've been, I hesitate often to say how long I've been in higher education, but we've been talking about the notion from a deficit perspective for years. I think the notion of underpreparedness keeps that discourse going. We have to move much more beyond what does it actually enable rather than prevent or block, and so on. Language, clearly. So English seems to pick itself as the medium of instruction in higher education. That doesn't mean that we should see that as taken for granted. And there's lots of fantastic work going on in the multilingualism space that enables us, and the trans-languaging space, and I'm not in that area, so I'm not going to talk about it much, but that gives us optimism for the extent to which we can build on multilingual engagement. The fact that we have multilingual classrooms, both sort of global South languages and global North languages, and we need to see those as that's part of the literacy that we're wanting to develop, and it's part of the academic resilience. Because to deny or to message to students that mother tongue is not important in higher education is to risk the possibility of resistance or worse, reluctance for students. Epistemology, belief systems, and our own positionality in higher education are also critical. I think we've been challenged massively in the last 3 or 4 years. We've been challenged massively to understand ourselves as academics and develop our own literacies in relation to who we are as gendered, historical, contextual beings in the space. And students, I think we need to understand or we need to have that as part of what we deal with when we're dealing with students. We are not simply cognitive or academic brains in the system. So at the macro level, if we move now, I would argue that in order for students to effectively develop academic resilience, we have to think about literacies in the whole system's perspective. At the macro level, higher education as a system has an attendant set of literacies associated with it that for some students are entirely opaque. And my argument here is that we risk the possibility that students will never understand that macro perspective, and possibly it's because we don't mediate it and filter it to those students. And that's, I think, a huge problem, because we risk generating students who leave the system perhaps with enhanced knowledge, but with sort of nothing else, or little or nothing else. And in academic development work, that's a key challenge. We assume that our work goes beyond just engagement with the everyday teaching, learning, and assessment work. So curriculum 2 is a literacy, and I'm not going to read through all of this in detail now, but simply to say that what Melanie Walker is referring to here in her work is that curriculum takes has a very wide literacies lens attached to it. We're going far beyond curriculum as being about the teaching and the learning and the assessment to the development of students, to the notion of critical engagement, and possibly even to this notion of the liberal arts curriculum, which takes us much wider than simply teaching subjects, courses, curricula, and so on. And I'm certainly not going into that debate now. I think we may well know that we have we struggle in this higher education system at the macro level with extremely tight curricula. So that's why it is so easy for students to end up on 4 and 5 and 6 year degree programs, because in some cases they need fail only one module to be in that situation, and they're automatically into a 4th or a 5th year in the academy. And we wonder why, in that case, resilience turns to resistance or reluctance. It's not surprising. Agency is being kind of automatically withdrawn from students in those systems. So it takes for us, I think, in participation at the macro level in literacies, it takes for us to question knowledge and the knowledge base of our own curricula. And that, please, does not mean that we drop Newtonian conceptions in physics, or that we dump the knowledge base and the knowledge build that has been developed in the hard sciences. Often people react to these kinds of ideas as to say, well, there is only kind of one form of knowledge. I think at minimum it takes for us to develop resilience in students, for us to give students an understanding that there are knowledge systems. There's not only one knowledge system, even in the hard sciences. Sorry, I'm sort of beating up on the hard sciences this morning. I don't mean to do that. I just mean I take those as examples because I know those are the things that come back to us. Okay, now I have 1 minute to gallop through the rest of this. So it takes the decentering, and this is my colleague DVC Lana at UCT, the decentering and the recentering of the knowledge project and knowledge systems. I think that's what the decolonial project has done for us in recent years. It's challenged the idea of where knowledge comes from. And that's critical both for us and for students if we're going to develop resilience in the system. And the roles played by teaching, learning, and assessment. And I said earlier, diversity as an affordance rather than some kind of stumbling block in this process. And language systems. Okay, I'm nearly done. So implications for academic development. I think the building of academic resilience, I'm wrapping up now, becomes a whole system focus. We move beyond a deficit view of the student to a focus on agency. We need to ask ourselves some critical questions in the literacy space in academic development work about the unintended consequences of our development work, and I'm drawing now on my colleague Kathy Luckett's work at UCT. We need to be careful about our notions of development and what that sort of takes away from students in terms of agency. So if we see our work as development work, it has a long history of association with benign colonialism, if you don't mind me saying. So if we take that view of development work, we run the risk of continuing to develop students who are dependent, who lack agency, and potentially quite reluctant in the system. It's not going to help our cause. Literacies are the responsibility of all in this relation to academic resilience. There are multiple communities of practice, and perhaps we should now be talking about resiliences rather than resilience. Resiliences are a sort of collective formulation with psychosocial as well as cognitive dimensions. So building academic resilience is not just about making students fit, as it were, for the purpose of teaching, learning and assessment, but developing much wider than that. And my final point here, as from the work of Mary Lee, it takes us away from the centering of skills-based and assimilationist views of literacy to an engagement with literacies that are imbued automatically, and we cannot avoid this, with dimensions of power, race, class, contestation, gender, inequalities, language, and so on. These are the realities. Social realist theory tells us that these are the realities of our everyday higher education classroom. Students don't leave themselves at the door, and it would be problematic if they do. And neither do we. We come into the higher education space as whole beings with our own agenda and different perspectives, and that is an affordance. That's a vital part of the development of resilience in students. So that's, as I said, a bit of a sort of perambulation through individual perspectives, meso perspectives at the programmatic and curriculum level, and macro perspectives, where my argument is that resilience is related to a whole systems engagement of the development of this work, including the work that we do in academic development and in foundation provision and in mainstream provision and so on. I know we use those terms all the time. Perhaps it's time even for us to challenge some of those notions in developing a better sense of what it means to have resilient students in higher education. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Allen. That was quite informative. Your keynote address on building student academic resilience, where Prof really explained why.
I don't want to be right in the spot.
No problem. Where you really explained why an embedded approach is required for developing resilience. And you really contextualized, gave insight and meaning in the psychology and also the social dimensions behind the development of resilience. So thank you for that. And then we're very fortunate to have Dr. Jansen with us. I can just see a range of workshops in the near future on this. So now I'm going to hand over to Ndu Gwani. He's going to facilitate the question and answer session. Ndu is the branch librarian at UNISA's Cape Town Library and has worked with UWC, CPUT and UCT before. So he's got an honours degree in library and information studies, and he will facilitate the question and answer session.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. And there's a one protocol observed. I'm just giving a sign that I must say on protocol observed, and to recognize people who are coming from elsewhere. But as you were clapping and I was walking to the podium here, I was like feeling that it could be the sound that I'll be hearing when I'm going back to my seat. Part of the thing, Professor Cliff, is that when you are asked to share a stage with somebody like Professor, you feel like this floor is not level. It's sort of like tipping on the other side, and you have to do your best to make it come to a level. But one of the advantages is that when you become a facilitator of this session and sharing a stage with Professor, you get access to like your abstract. But when we were talking now, I felt like you did a montage on me, and montage means you made some U-turns from your abstract, especially about the construct theory. And now I had to change my script and say attribution theory is what you said. Yes. I see we limited in terms of time, the things I wanted to say, besides thanking John for dropping me into the deep end of this, asking me to do this job. I'm not an academic. I'm a support staff. So resilience for me is something that I see every day. This year, this is my 10th year at UNISA, and I can tell you, without having done any research, I have seen people who have been coming in and then coming back again, coming in and then coming back again. And when you meet those people, some of them will greet you, some of them hesitate to greet you because they're actually bouncing back, they're coming back, as John has said yesterday, they're trying to come back, they're trying to be resilient so that they can achieve what they want. And I'm not an exception. I've dropped out 3 times in my master's program. I've blamed my lecturer, I've blamed my supervisor, so that I can justify why I got out of the system. So next year I said, I'm going to change my program, I'm going to bounce back, I'm going to go back again, and the silly thing that I'm going to do a different thing. Okay? And I remember the last time I actually, resilient left me. You see, when you talk about resilience this way, now it becomes a person, it becomes like something you can touch. And then you become, I remember the day when I actually, resilient left me in my study at home. I actually closed the book. I remember the time of the day, the time of the night, I simply closed the book, like respectfully, I closed the book, and then I left it like that, collected all my books, and I returned them back to the library. I don't know how I felt. Did I feel guilty or did I feel like relieved? But over some time I felt, there's something wrong that I did there. I must be resilient. Okay, let's go back to Prof. Prof, I'm going to just summarize based simply on your abstracts, because you spoke so well, I didn't have time to make note of all these things. Yeah, so basically you spoke about the global north. That resilience comes from the north, the way it is defined, but you want it to be now defined from the global south perspective. And you said you're looking at it from the literacy's lens, that we should actually include resilience as part of literacy's work, as part of the program, because we have realized it is quite a problem. And you're asking your colleagues in academia to actually modify their visions of literacy so that they include it, because it's a serious problem in terms of throughput as well. Now, you're saying there's an opportunity in terms of student protests. Your decolonization debate, you're saying people should not be narrow-minded. They should actually be able to actually talk about resilience. Now, if you're at UNISA, you want to talk about identity, for example, and resilience, and you're sitting with over 300,000 students, where are you going to start? So it's not a one-size-fits-all. If I have to know who am I talking to online, it's like online dating. It can be, it can be anybody, it's like that. That's a feeling sometimes I get, like when you're working at UNISA, it's like there's somebody there on the other side and you are here and you're trying to size yourselves up, yeah, and see if there is a match or not, okay? And you're saying there's a huge inequalities of digital space, that we know, that there are people who stay in, I always call them hamadulas, people who stay so far away from our cities, who have registered at UNISA, who we are actually obliged to actually give support. So what are we saying about those people? And you also spoke about decentering or centering, which is almost the same as decolonization, that people are going into the spaces because they want to be here. Okay. Now, I was shown 10 minutes. I'm not sure if that 10 minutes is part of the questions, or will I be added some 10 minutes? The rules are very clear. Yes. The rules are very clear. We're going to take about 2 questions at a time, and then after that, our Prof will actually give a response. I think we can also take comments as well. Can I do the Felicia Babuza shuttle, walking around, or there will be other people giving out microphones? Yes. Okay. I saw Dr. Shaida, your hand was up. Is for a question? So we've got the number 1 there, maybe number 2, okay? So, you belong to the 3rd round. Can somebody just make notes for me? Dr. Shaila first, and then that lady over there, and then C4 will be 3rd, part of the 2nd round, and then we have Mr. Popo, and then 2nd round there, and then the 3rd round would be Voyo, and then I just need the last one for the 3rd round. Okay, Dr. Shaila?
Thank you so much, Professor. I think the first is just a comment. I'm a psychologist by profession, and I was very happy to hear you confirming what the literature says about psychology being quite individualistic and quite loyal to the global north in terms of its theories and its philosophies. Now, the question that I have is related to when I see your very broad and quite substantial presentation. A lot of what needs to come into literacies is from what I would call from the neck downwards, not from the neck upwards. So that to move away from the cognitive. I want to know what progress is being made in literacies to include personhood. Because I'm thinking personhood is different from social identity. You know, where it's myself thinking this is who I am in gender, but personhood is actually culturally defined notions of who I am. So I want to know, in literacies, are there progress being made in bringing personhood into the literacy space? Thank you.
Rina?
Is it my turn?
Good morning, Professor Cliff. Thank you for that. Very thought-provoking presentation. You mentioned earlier on that resistance can also be a form of resilience. And I wondered whether you could expand on that a little bit. And I also wondered when you spoke about it is important to enable students to read the academy. And that's more, that in my mind is more than negotiating disciplinary text or cross-disciplinary text. Could you expand a little bit more on that and the implications for curriculum development and in future? What do we include? If we say resilience is broader than the development of coping skills that are individualized, what kind of interventions do you think could create a sense of agency, not only for students, but also for staff and their growth and development in this complex environment? Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure how much time we have, so I'm going to try and be as brief as possible so there's time for more questions. I'm not sure what follows this. Is it tea after this? Okay, so I'll just stand between you and tea. Okay, so the individualistic thing, just endorsed. Absolutely, I think we can benefit a lot from moving away from individualistic conceptions and I think also student-only centered conceptions of resilience. So yes, the neck downwards work. I think I don't want to give an impression that we as academic development practitioners and theorists have to take this all on ourselves. I think what we've done well in the AD space is understand that we have particular roles. I know sometimes we feel like we're doing everything. We're parent, psychologist, therapist, support system, everything to students. But I think what we've done poorly at is that we've continued to operate in the academy in silos. So we've decided, we've taken on specialisms, which are perfectly acceptable and a part of the knowledge space in higher education, but we've neglected to say, we can't do everything on our own, and who are the other people who are part of that space? So the neck downwards work doesn't have to be taken on by us alone. It needs to be taken on by a team, if you like, of specialists, a team of support staff, etc., etc. And what I mean by sort of higher education systems literacy is that we need to understand the functioning of the system differently. We've historically taken this, as I say, siloed approach. We still do it. We still, and in the challenging space we find ourselves in now, I think we have to do differently. It's not working well enough to say, for example, to students, okay, I'm your maths lecturer, for psychological support go somewhere else. We need to be more connected to each other so that the referral we make is much more meaningful, so that the neck downwards work, as you refer to it, can be done, but it doesn't have to be taken on by us. It can be taken on by people that we know about, that we trust, and that we've had conversation with, so that we work together on these things. Yeah, I mean, my personal example is I don't really have a clue about who the health and wellness people are in my institution. That's problematic for my work. It means I don't have an understanding of those connections and so on. The personhood thing, I think capabilities theory has helped us quite strongly in this area to understand the curriculum as going far beyond the imparting of knowledge. So, I mean, I suppose a loose conflation of personhood would be in the area of graduate attributes. I think that's what we're talking about. But it goes, I understand this to be much deeper and wider than that. I suppose in consonant with my own talk, I have to say, well, what do we mean by personhood? Because just like with resilience, what do we understand that to be? And there again, we have to be careful not to assume that personhood has a certain sort of neoliberal Western global north kind of definition. Because what personhood means for people in our own country is very different across a wide spectrum. So we have to understand that before we can build it in. Resistance as resilience, ma'am, your question at the back there. I'm suggesting that sometimes resistance can be a positive manifestation. We might automatically assume resistance to be something problematic, something of an obstacle. There's plenty of evidence in higher education, especially now, where students have adopted resistant positions out of a resilient space. It is their resilience. What we, I think, have to do is not make these things binary. So resistance and resilience are kind of the same thing with different forms and in different contexts as well. And what we, I think, have not done well at in terms of enabling resilience is that we've taken up in many spaces a sort of student versus academic thing in higher education. So part of understanding how resistance works and how it can be a positive force might be to try to deeply understand one another better and understand what we mean, where that resistance comes from. Of course, sometimes resistance is, to go back to psychoanalysis, is very much from the id. It's a kind of childlike reaction. It's a sort of throw the dummy reaction. But it's not helpful for us to take that position if we're going to build resilience. The reading the academy thing, yeah, and again, we must be careful not to say that the academy is static either. I don't mean read the academy, because we'll find if we try to read the academy as a static, unchanging thing, it will pass us by and we'll start trying to read again. I just think that we must take a much wider view of the work we do in higher education, where it comes from, its histories, its systems, the role of higher education in educational development work and so on. All those kinds of things need to be part of how we understand a reading of the academy. So reading in the broad, so here the literacy perspective gives us a wide lens. It tells us to see text as anything in effect that can be read, including the multimodal, including the physical infrastructure. We've had difficulties on our own campus, struggled on our own campus relatively recently in saying students do not see themselves represented in the buildings in the academy. That's part of that reading of the academy. we can't just assume that literacy is contained in our classrooms. It's much wider than that, and we risk an impoverished engagement with students. We risk a superficial treatment of the notion or development of resilience if we stick to that sort of quite narrow reading of the academy. And then what interventions could create a sense of agency? Again, I think we have to do this together. We have to understand that our work is complementary. I mean, for example, I think we don't talk enough to each other, even in the academic space. We don't spend enough time planning curricula together, where we can look at the notion of agency and how our different courses and curricula, vertically and laterally, actually connect. And the purpose of our curriculum being eventually, hopefully, to have students be able to articulate from undergraduate to postgraduate. So it's those kinds of conversations that, at minimum, we again, if we take the history of higher education, especially from a global north perspective, it's seen as sort of autonomous, self-operating, etc. We are severely challenged if we continue with that notion, especially if we continue it as being, the optimum, because then we're not going to be able to work out the interventions that are needed. But just the same, I think interventions need us to take students into them as well. So it's students who participate in those interventions too, or in the development of them, the construction of them. Sorry, that's a very quick answer to a very important and big question.
Thank you, Prof. We're going to take the other two questions. Please try to be brief. Sisiko as well as Uyo.
Morning, everyone. I'm going to try to be brief. Mine is actually a comment more than a question. So I actually like what you said when you said for resilience to be meaningful, there needs to be a contextualization. And now I want to say, in fact, my question would be, how do we develop student resilience in academics? Firstly, I want to make people understand one thing, that in as much as we want to develop students, I'm worried about inclusivity of students and how we can sit here and have conversations regarding academics, right? But you must understand, you will remember that at some point we had decolonization of education. I want to try and include as many students as possible. You will realize that in as much as we come into the institutions of higher learning, you come across different students with different backgrounds. And you need to understand that if I am from a poor background, there are things that I cannot relate to when they are being told, or rather when they are being taught to me. And at UNISA, for instance, I'll make an example. I have a book in front of me. Some of the modules that we get, you do not have tutorials even. Now, you can imagine if there is no inclusivity in that regard, it will mean that I will not relate to whatever that is supposed to be fed to me, and instead, we are forever going to have students who are going to study for the sake of making it out, just to get that qualification. And it means you are not exactly educating that person. They don't have anything. It's not even banking education, to say the least. It's just a matter of, there's this context, I'm grabbing it, I must go write an exam, and that's it. So my comment, basically, we need to look into how students can be included in the discussions and conversations regarding how we can shape our education in itself. Thank you.
Thank you.
So my short response to that would be absolutely, that's what I mean by reading the academy. So students, it's not immediately apparent, for example, to students, the opaque and arcane systems by which we develop curriculum, for example. And if we don't make those open and understandable and negotiated and so on, students will not be able to develop the kind of resilience we want them to have. especially those who, I mean, one of our goals would be that we want some of those students to be academics themselves one day. You know, it needs to happen. It needs to happen not by chance. Students should survive and develop and thrive in higher education because of us, not in spite of us.
Real quickly, can I just say that because we're running out of time, Mr. Prof, your question, do you mind to address it with Prof? Will be here at June T? Yeah, because we're running out of time. Will, the last question.
Good morning, everyone. Professor, I would like to thank you first for striking a chord with this very interesting and broad topic, which was necessary. And it's always been history, but now I'm happy that it's finally coming to academics. These conversations are happening, that you cannot only focus on academics. It's also social. We're human beings, and it encompasses a holistic view needs to happen. But I would like to mention one thing. You spoke about literacy, and I'd like to when you said it's not just good to read, but to understand and to engage and to debate about issues. That for me starts at basic education from grade R to grade 3. If we don't teach our kids to actually engage us in their book readings, then we are not teaching anything. And I think the sad part is that you spoke about secondary and higher education, but you're not speaking about the feeder, the one of basic education, because from grade 1 up until grade 12, that's one of basic education. And now universities have been always become had a very simple output that to make me ready for work and for life. But now it's become institutions of corrections of the past disparities that were created by government. And I feel that we can't have this conversation if basic education is not there, because then the foundation is not there. And we cannot solve anything if we're not starting kids from grade R and grade 3, and also carry through them till metric, because you can't focus on pass rates. What about those primary schools that don't have the facilities? And if you don't address those inequalities there, you can never address them at university level. For instance, now, there's schools that have libraries from grade R, and schools with no libraries. How do you tell me to love reading if there's no library? There's no resources, there's no newspapers. Then I can't, for instance, reason with you now at university level and engage you as my lecturer. It's going to be a problem, and I'll feel like I don't belong. That's where resistance in a negative manner comes in, because I don't belong here. And I feel angry because now I'm here now, because you've opened up the borders in terms of provinces and said I can go to any province to go to education. But you haven't then prepared me that UCT is on a hill, for instance. UWC has resources, UNIS has resources. And here I have to now catch up from my grade to my grade 12 to kids that have been catch up there all along. Then that's where the negative aspect comes in and brings all the social problems that are coming. So can you please, in your research, engage with education, of basic education? If it's uncomfortable, it needs to be uncomfortable, because it will never change unless it's uncomfortable. And the thing is, now this problem can never be solved at higher education because it's not demanding. Because you have 3 years to actually make me ready for work. I won't be ready for work if you're busy now fixing how I'm supposed to reason with you. Because by the time that I finish, I can't, for instance, work and then say to my boss, this is not like 8 minutes because my university failed me because they're busy trying to fix problems which I'm not there to fix. Thank you.
I'll make a quick response because now the tea is getting cold. So let me say 2 things. One, I think that where we've created a problem for ourselves is by not seeing education as a continuum, so by not seeing the things that we do as indeed starting at the primary level. But I think we have to also be careful not to take everything on ourselves. We have to understand the collaborative relationships we have. We have to understand the continuum and the transitions between primary, secondary, and tertiary education, but also understand that we've got to call on other people to do work with us. So we've had a history in academic development of exhausting ourselves, of perhaps wasting resources by trying to do everything in every space. We've got to be selective. We've got to understand what our expertise is and what it contributes. but in association with other groups, with other parties. It's not helpful for us to be pointing fingers backwards and forwards, as we often do, where we say it is the secondary school's fault that these students are as they are when they arrive here. If it is, that's not a useful response. The useful response would be, so how do we, within our situations and our higher education spaces, respond to those things? And what are our expertises that enable us to respond? Again, from the literacy perspective. Okay.
Good day, my name is David Asher. I'm a alumni member of UNISA. I'm also a tutor at UNISA and I'm teaching economics. What I basically saw today with Professor Cliff was very informative. I think he highlighted very few important points that regarding resilience in the academic space that I think we are so importantly looking at. So I feel that we as tutors need to take that into our classrooms and need to apply that, because that is the type of resilience coming from different, if you look at our type of students that we have in our classrooms. So we need to identify that, and we need to actually understand where students are coming from and that articulation gap that we experience. Thank you so much.
Okay, I feel it's very productive. I learned a lot in this small space, the small time that I'm here now, and I will take what I learned here back to my college and try to apply to my work and implement with my students. Thank you.
So I found the keynote address quite interesting this morning. It definitely resonated in terms of the work that I do at the Chrysalis Academy, particularly around social learning theory and the importance of context and the importance of having young people, students reflected in the staff and in the buildings and in the actual institution itself.
Right. No, I think the topic about culture and resilience and that in the education space is very important, and I think it's issues that should have been addressed years ago, and it's a pity it had to come to this, that we are forced now to address it. But very, very exciting, very interesting topics. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
I'd like to say the first session by Dr. or Professor Alan Cliff was really encouraging, because I think that all of us need to be going beyond just teaching and learning. So I'm going to take back what I learned, and it's great being here. Thank you.